I'll never forget that Monday morning. The sun was just beginning to peek through the streets of Valencia, and I was already ready, dressed in my best suit, with my heart pounding like crazy. It was my first day at the Carter family business, the company that my mother-in-law, Mrs. Carter, had built with grit and determination over decades. Now, supposedly, it was her son Julian's turn, my husband's, to take the helm. And I, naively confident, believed I could bring something valuable to the table. The building of Carter and Associates towered proudly in the heart of the city. I took a deep breath before walking through the glass doors, mentally reviewing everything I'd prepared for the day: fresh ideas, marketing strategies, even some proposals to modernize our systems. I was determined to prove that I wasn't just the daughter-in-law, but a capable and committed professional. The moment I set foot in the reception area, I felt the atmosphere shift. Employees' glances, a mix of curiosity and wariness, followed me as I made my way toward the main office. And there she was, Mrs. Carter, sporting her signature tight bun and a gaze that could freeze the Mediterranean in mid-August. "You're late," she barked, her voice scraping the air. I checked my watch, puzzled. It was exactly 8 a.m., but I began to explain, showing her the time on my wrist. "In this company," she cut in, "being on time means you're late. I expected more from you, Mary." Her tone made it clear she really expected nothing from me. Swallowing hard, I tried to keep my composure. I glanced over at Julian, hoping for some support, but he was busy reviewing some papers, as if this whole scene were perfectly normal. "Well," I said, forcing a smile, "I'm ready to get started. Where do we begin?" "I have some ideas I'd like to share about," Mrs. Carter interrupted with a dry laugh. "Ideas? From you? Dear, here things are done the way they've always been done. We don't need you coming in to shake things up." I felt a flush rising to my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from indignation. I'd worked hard to get here, studied the business, prepared myself. And for what? To be treated like an interloper. "Carter," Julian finally interjected, "give her a chance. Mary is more than capable." For a moment, I felt a spark of hope. Perhaps with Julian on my side, things might change. But that hope vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Of course I'll give you a chance," Mrs. Carter replied with a smile that never reached her eyes. She turned on her heel and, to my surprise, returned carrying a mop and a bucket. "Here you go, dear. The reception area needs a good cleaning. Show us what you're capable of." I stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Was this some kind of cruel joke? A twisted initiation test? I looked at Julian for an explanation, but he merely shrugged, as if saying, "That's just how it is." "But I have a degree in business administration," I managed to say. "I came here to work in management, not here. Everyone does everything," Mrs. Carter cut me off. "If you think you're too good to do a little cleaning, perhaps you don't belong in this family business." Family. That word echoed in my mind. Is this really how family is treated? I looked around for any sign of solidarity on my coworkers' faces, but everyone avoided my gaze, suddenly absorbed in their own tasks. With trembling hands, I took the mop. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was wrong, that I should turn around and leave the way I came. But something inside me, perhaps pride, perhaps stubbornness, kept me rooted to the spot. I would prove I could handle this, and more. As I mopped the floor, which, frankly, didn't even need cleaning, my mind whirled. How had I ended up in this situation? I recalled the night Julian proposed I join the company. We had been dining on our terrace, the sea breeze caressing us and the scent of orange blossoms in the air. Everything had seemed perfect then. He spoke of a bright future, of working together, of taking the family business to new heights. "It'll be tough at first," he had warned. "My mother is, well, you know her. But over time, she'll see just how valuable you are." Now, with the smell of disinfectant filling my nostrils and humiliation weighing on my shoulders, those words rang hollow. Had Julian really not foreseen this? Or worse, did he know and still throw me to the wolves? I spent the next hour scrubbing every corner of the reception area, not because it was necessary, but because I refused to give Mrs. Carter the satisfaction of seeing me give up. Every time I passed by the main office, I could feel her eyes on me, scrutinizing every move. Finally, when the floor shone so brightly I could nearly see my reflection, I straightened up, my back aching and my pride bruised, but not broken. "I'm done," I announced, stepping into Mrs. Carter's office without knocking. She looked up from her papers, arching an eyebrow. "Well, it seems you can follow instructions after all," she said with a hint of sarcasm. "Now you can." "Now," I interrupted, surprising even myself with my boldness, "I'd like to discuss my real responsibilities in this company. I didn't come here to be a cleaning lady." The silence that followed was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Julian, who had been sitting in a corner of the office all this time, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mary," he began in a conciliatory tone that only further irritated me. "I understand this isn't what you expected, but..." "No, Julian," I cut him off. "You don't understand anything. You promised me a real opportunity, not this." I turned to Mrs. Carter, who was watching me with a mixture of surprise and something that almost seemed like respect. "Mrs. Carter, I understand this is your company and that things have been done a certain way for a long time. But if you really want to grow and adapt to the times, you need fresh ideas. I'm here to offer that, not to be a laughingstock or a threat to your authority." For a moment, I thought I had made a grave mistake, that at any second, Mrs. Carter would kick me out of the office. But then, against all odds, a faint smile appeared on her lips. "You've got guts, girl," she finally said. "I'll give you that. But you'll need more than pretty words to earn a place here." "I'm willing to prove myself," I replied, feeling a spark of hope. "I just asked for a fair chance." Mrs. Carter studied me for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then, with a sigh, she gestured to a chair in front of her desk. "Sit down. Let's see what you've got to offer." As I sat, a mixture of relief and apprehension washed over me. I had passed the first test, but I knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and challenges, but I was determined to face them, one by one. I glanced sideways at Julian, who seemed relieved yet somewhat surprised by my stance. I realized that if I wanted to succeed here, I couldn't rely on him to defend me. I'd have to do it on my own. As I began outlining my ideas, with Mrs. Carter listening intently and Julian taking notes, I sensed that something had changed. I wasn't sure if it was for better or worse, but one thing was clear. My life at Carter and Associates was not going to be easy, and I was ready to fight for my place. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions. After that hellish first day, things seemed to improve slightly. Although Mrs. Carter remained distant and cold, she at least allowed me to attend some meetings and review a few reports. Still, the tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. One particularly hot July morning, I arrived at the office early, as had become my habit. The building was almost empty, only the security guard at the entrance and the distant hum of the cleaning lady on the upper floors. I made my way to my small desk, strategically, or rather, cruelly, placed just outside Mrs. Carter's office, so I could keep an eye on her at all times. Barely had I booted up my computer when I heard my mother-in-law's sharp voice, "Mary, come here immediately." Her tone promised nothing good. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for whatever awaited, and entered her office. Mrs. Carter was standing by the window, the morning light casting a halo around her figure. For a moment, she almost looked ethereal, if not for the hardness in her gaze. Julian was seated in a corner, his expression unreadable. "What's this about?" Mrs. Carter demanded, tossing a stack of papers onto her desk. I stepped closer and recognized one of the reports I'd been working on the previous week, a detailed analysis of our competitors along with some proposals to improve our market position. "It's the report you asked for, ma'am," I replied, trying to stay calm. "About the competition and possible strategies too, I know what it is," she interrupted. "What I want to know is why you think you have the right to question decades of work with your revolutionary ideas." I felt frustration bubbling up inside me. I had poured hours into researching and analyzing data for that report, all to propose improvements that could benefit the company. "With all due respect, Mrs. Carter," I began, choosing my words carefully, "I'm not questioning past work. I'm suggesting ways for us to adapt to a changing market. If we don't evolve, we'll be left behind. I saw her eyes narrow, a sign I'd come to fear over the past weeks. Evolve? Are you implying that my company is obsolete? No, Silence, she shouted, slamming her hand onto the desk. The sound reverberated through the room, making me jump. Listen to me, girl. I don't care what you think. I won't allow you to come in here with your college ideas and tell me how to run my business. I felt my blood boil. Weeks of pent-up frustration, feeling undervalued and underestimated, finally erupted. And why not? I yelled back. What's so wrong with considering new ideas? The world is changing, and if we remain stagnant, you'll lose everything you've built. The ensuing silence was deafening. Julian, who had been silent until now, stood up from his chair but didn't move closer. He seemed torn between intervening and staying on the sidelines. Mrs. Carter glared at me, and for a moment I saw something other than anger in her eyes. Was it fear? Insecurity? Whatever it was, it quickly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculated fury. If this is your idea of integration, she said in a low, dangerous tone, if you think you can come here and take control, you're gravely mistaken. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I'm not trying to take control. I just want to help to contribute. I thought that's why you asked me to join the company. Then Julian finally spoke. Mary, I think you should calm down. My mother is right. You can't just show up and expect to change everything overnight. His words hit me like a slap. Wasn't he the one who had encouraged me to join, promising that together we could grow the business? Where was that support now? You too, Julian? I asked, unable to hide the disappointment in my voice. I thought we were in this together. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. It's complicated, Mary. There are traditions here, ways of doing things. Traditions that are suffocating us, I snapped. Frustration gave way to anger, and the words spilled out uncontrollably. If we continue like this, in a few years there won't be any company left to run. Is that what you want? Mrs. Carter, who had been watching our exchange with an inscrutable expression, suddenly moved. I didn't see what happened next until, in one swift motion, she grabbed the teacup from her desk and, without warning, hurled its contents directly at me. The hot liquid splashed onto my arm and part of my chest, soaking my blouse and burning my skin. The pain was immediate and intense, drawing a cry of surprise and agony from me. What the hell do you think you're doing? I shouted, backing away and trying to shake off the scalding tea. My skin burned, and I could feel blisters forming in the most affected areas. Chaos erupted in the office. Julian rushed over, torn between helping me and restraining his mother. Mrs. Carter, for her part, stood frozen, the now empty cup still in her hand, and a look of shock on her face, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just done. Mom, Julian finally yelled. What have you done? But Mrs. Carter quickly regained her composure. In a cold, controlled voice she said, it was an accident. The cup slipped from my hand. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. An accident? I'd clearly seen how she aimed at me before launching the tea. The burning pain on my arm was a constant reminder that this was anything but an accident. Accident? I repeated, my voice trembling with pain and indignation. You attacked me on purpose. Julian stepped closer to examine my arm. Mary, calm down. I'm sure my mother didn't mean. I shoved him away, unable to contain my anger and disappointment. Don't touch me. How can you defend her after what she just did? The atmosphere in the office became stifling. The few employees who had arrived early peered in through the door, drawn by the commotion. I felt exposed, humiliated, and above all, betrayed. I think you should go home, Mary, Mrs. Carter said in a tone that sent shivers down my spine. Take the day to reflect on your behavior. My behavior? I echoed in disbelief for a moment. I looked at Julian, expecting him to say something, to defend me, to acknowledge the absurdity of the situation. But he simply looked down, avoiding eye contact. Are you serious? I asked, glancing between my husband and my mother-in-law. I'm attacked, and now I'm the one who has to leave? Silence was his only response. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Gathering every ounce of dignity I could muster, I headed for the door. Before leaving, I turned back one last time. "This isn't over," I warned, my voice trembling with contained emotion. "What happened today is unacceptable." I left the office with determined steps, ignoring the curious stares of my colleagues. The pain in my arm was intense, but the ache in my heart was far worse. As I rode the elevator down, tears finally began to fall. How had it come to this? How could my own family treat me this way? Stepping out of the building, the summer heat of Valencia hit me like a slap. I paused on the sidewalk, unsure where to go or what to do next. A part of me wanted to go back, confront Mrs. Carter, and demand justice. Another part just wanted to run, to get as far away from it all as possible. Eventually, I began to walk aimlessly. The streets of Valencia, usually so welcoming and familiar, now seemed strange and hostile. I passed by bustling cafes and gleaming shop windows, feeling utterly disconnected from everything. After wandering for what felt like hours, I found myself in the Turia Garden, the former riverbed turned park. I sat on a bench surrounded by trees and the gentle murmur of nearby fountains. It was an oasis of calm amid the raging storm inside me. Watching families stroll by and children play, an idea started to form. I couldn't let this go on, not just for my sake, but for everyone suffering under Mrs. Carter's outdated and cruel management. I pulled out my phone and, with trembling fingers, dialed a number I hadn't called in ages. When a familiar voice answered on the other end, I felt a mix of relief and determination. "Alex? It's Mary. I need your help." My older brother, always my rock in difficult times, listened in silence as I recounted everything that had happened. When I finished, his voice was a blend of concern and resolve. "I'm on my way," he said without hesitation. "I'll be in Valencia in 2 hours. Don't do anything until I get there, okay?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Thank you, Alex. I'll wait for you." After hanging up, I felt a new strength growing within me. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of my fight for justice, and this time, I wouldn't be alone. Time seemed to drag as I waited for Alex to arrive. Every minute felt like an hour, and the pain in my arm, though slightly less intense, was a constant reminder of what had happened. I decided to leave the Turia Garden. I didn't want Julian or anyone from the office to find me there. I wandered through Valencia's winding alleys and bustling plazas, letting my feet guide me. Eventually, I found myself in front of Valencia Cathedral. The imposing building, with its blend of architectural styles, seemed to watch over me with a calm that starkly contrasted the chaos inside. I sat on the steps, watching tourists and locals pass by, each absorbed in their own world, oblivious to the drama unfolding in mine. It was there, in the shadow of the cathedral, that Alex found me. His usually relaxed, jovial face was etched with a seriousness I'd rarely seen. Without a word, he sat beside me and wrapped me in a comforting embrace. In that moment, all the tears I'd been holding back finally flowed freely. "Calm down, sis," he murmured, gently stroking my back. "I'm here. We're going to fix this." Once I'd calmed down, I recounted everything in detail, the hostility from Mrs. Carter from day one, Julian's passive support, and, finally, the tea incident. Alex listened silently, his brow furrowing more with each word. "This is unacceptable," he said at last, his voice laden with indignation. "It's not just workplace abuse, it's physical assault. Mary, you need to report this." The idea of filing a complaint filled me with a mix of fear and relief. "But Alex, she's Julian's family. If I do this, my marriage, your marriage is already in jeopardy," he interrupted softly. "A husband who doesn't defend you in a situation like this. Mary, you have to think about yourself now." His words, though harsh, struck a truth I'd been trying to ignore. Julian, the man who'd promised to love and protect me, had failed me when I needed him most. "You're right," I finally admitted. "But I don't know where to start." Mrs. Carter wields so much power, so many connections. Alex smiled, and for the first time since he arrived, I saw that familiar spark of confidence in his eyes. "She may have power, but we have the truth on our side." And something else, he then revealed something I hadn't known. In his work as a lawyer, Alex had been investigating irregularities in companies in our industry, and Carter and Associates had come under his radar. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure, he explained, but there are indications of some questionable financial practices at the company. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to apply pressure if needed. The revelation left me stunned. Financial irregularities? In the very company Mrs. Carter always boasted of running with an iron fist and complete transparency? Suddenly, many things began to make sense. The resistance to any change, the hostility toward my modernization proposals, the nervousness among some employees when I asked about certain procedures. Alex, if this is true, what do we do? I asked, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. First, he said, rising and extending his hand, we document your injuries. Then we'll prepare our strategy. We're not going to let them get away with this. We spent the rest of the day moving through the city like a covert mission. First, we visited a medical center where a doctor examined and documented the burns on my arm. Then, Alex took me to his hotel, where we spent hours poring over documents and formulating our strategy. As the sun began to set, painting the Valencia sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a blend of exhaustion and determination. We'd decided that tomorrow we'd return to the office, not to beg or negotiate, but to confront Mrs. Carter and Julian with the truth. That night, as I struggled to sleep in the hotel room Alex insisted I take, he would sleep on the couch. My phone vibrated. It was a message from Julian. Mary, where are you? I'm worried. Please come home so we can talk. I stared at the message for a long time, a stab of pain in my chest. Now he was worried? After leaving me alone in the wake of his mother's attack? With trembling hands, I typed a response. I'm fine. We'll talk tomorrow, but not at home. At the office. I turned off my phone before he could reply. I needed to focus on what tomorrow would bring. The next morning dawned clear and hot, typical of a Valencian summer. Alex and I ate breakfast in silence at a cafe near the office. The coffee tasted bitter in my mouth, and even the croissant I usually enjoyed seemed like cardboard. Nerves churned in my stomach. Are you ready? Alex asked as we walked toward the Carter and Associates building. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the folder full of documents in my purse. As ready as I can be. Entering the building, I noticed employees' eyes fixed on us. Some looked surprised to see me. Others quickly averted their gaze. It was clear that rumors about yesterday's events had spread. Without stopping at reception, we headed straight for Mrs. Carter's office. My heart pounded, but Alex's presence beside me gave me strength. We entered without knocking. Mrs. Carter was seated behind her desk, with Julian standing beside her. Both looked up, startled by our sudden entrance. Mary, Julian began, stepping toward me. Not now, Julian, I interrupted, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I turned to Mrs. Carter, who looked at us with a mix of surprise and disdain. We need to talk. Mrs. Carter leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. And who is this? She asked, gesturing toward Alex with a subtle nod. I'm Alex Carter, Mary's brother and an attorney, he replied, his voice calm but firm. We're here to discuss yesterday's incident and other matters. I saw a flash of concern in Mrs. Carter's eyes, quickly replaced by her usual mask of arrogance. I don't know what you're talking about. If you mean that little accident yesterday, I already apologized for it. Accident? I repeated, feeling indignation welling up. You attacked me on purpose. I have medical proof of the burns. Julian visibly paled. Mother, is this true? Mrs. Carter waved her hand dismissively. Please, it was just a moment of frustration. Mary was being insubordinate. Alex interjected, his voice laced with disbelief. Is that how you justify physical assault? Mrs. Carter, this is very serious. But I'm afraid it isn't the only thing we have to discuss. With a fluid motion, Alex retrieved a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the desk. We've been investigating certain irregularities in the company's finances. I think you'll find this interesting. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since I'd known her, Mrs. Carter looked genuinely frightened. Julian, meanwhile, shifted his gaze between the folder, his mother, and me, as if unable to decide where to focus. "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Carter finally said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "You have no right to. We have every right," I interrupted. "As an employee and a member of this family, I have the right to know what's really going on in this company." Julian, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Mary, I didn't know about this." "Really?" I searched his eyes for any sign of deceit, but all I saw was confusion and remorse. For a moment, I felt sorry for him, trapped between his mother and me, between the weight of family traditions and the desire to do what's right. "Julian," I said softly, "I need to know which side you're on. You can't remain a bystander in your own life, in our life." I watched him struggle internally, his gaze shifting between his mother and me. Finally, with a deep sigh, he stepped toward me. "I'm with you, Mary. I should have been all along." Mrs. Carter let out a stifled cry. "Julian, how do you betray me like this?" "It's not betrayal, Mother," he replied, his voice gaining strength. "It's doing what's right. We've allowed things to go too far." I turned to Mrs. Carter, who now seemed to have aged 10 years in just a few minutes. "You have two options," I said, surprising myself with the calm in my voice. "We can take this to court, expose all the irregularities and abuse, or we can reach an agreement." "An agreement," she whispered. Alex took over. "You step aside. Let Julian and Mary take control of the company. We'll implement the necessary changes to correct the irregularities and modernize operations. In return, we won't press charges or make this public." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. I could see the internal struggle in Mrs. Carter's eyes, pride battling the reality of her situation. Finally, with a sigh of defeat, she nodded. "Fine. You win." A wave of emotions washed over me, relief, triumph, and a tinge of sadness. This wasn't how I'd imagined things would resolve when I joined the family business. As we left the office, with Julian by my side and Alex closing the door behind us, I realized this wasn't an end, but a new beginning. We had a lot of work ahead to correct past mistakes and build a better future for the company and for ourselves. I looked at Julian, who met my gaze with a mixture of remorse and hope. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I promise things will be different from now on." I nodded, knowing there was much to discuss, much to heal. But for now, I allowed myself a glimmer of hope. We had weathered the storm and emerged on the other side, bruised but not defeated. In the days that followed the confrontation, life at the office moved in a whirlwind. Julian and I threw ourselves into reorganizing the company, trying to untangle years of mismanagement and questionable practices. We spent our nights talking, sometimes arguing, other times reconciling, trying to rebuild the trust that had been shattered between us. Mrs. Carter, true to her word, officially stepped aside, though her shadow still loomed over the office. Some employees, used to her authoritarian style, seemed lost without her constant orders and criticisms. Others, however, flourished under our new leadership, bringing fresh ideas and enthusiasm that had been dormant for years. One afternoon, as I was reviewing some documents in what had become our shared office, Julian entered with a worried look on his face. "Mary," he said, closing the door behind him, "I think we have a problem." I looked up from my papers, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "What's wrong?" Julian sat down across from me, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I'd come to recognize as stress. "I've been going through some old contracts and there are discrepancies. I think my mother might have done more than just adjust some numbers." My mind raced. What else could Mrs. Carter have done? How deep did these irregularities run? "Show me," I said, reaching for the documents Julian carried. We spent the next few hours submerged in contracts, invoices, and financial statements. With every page we turned, the picture grew darker. There wasn't just some number tweaking. There were ghost contracts, duplicate invoices, and, worse, signs of possible money laundering. "My God, Julian," I murmured, a mix of horror and despair washing over me. "This is far worse than we thought." "If this gets out, I know," he replied, his voice heavy with concern. "We could lose everything, the company, our reputation, even face criminal charges." I finished for him. We fell silent, the gravity of our discovery crushing us. We had thought that by taking over the company we were starting a new chapter, but now it seemed we'd inherited a ticking time bomb. What are we going to do? Julian asked, his voice small and vulnerable, more so than I'd ever heard it. I stood up and moved to the window, gazing out at the city of Valencia stretching before us. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, a beautiful display that cruelly contrasted with the turmoil in my heart. Then an idea began to form, risky and perhaps even a little crazy, but it might be our only way out. Julian, I said, turning to him, remember that modernization project I proposed when I first joined the company? The one your mother outright rejected. He nodded, confused. Yes, but what does that have to do with? Everything, I interrupted. That project wouldn't just update our systems, it would require a complete review of all our processes and finances. I saw understanding dawn on Julian's face. And during that review, we could officially uncover these irregularities, I completed. And more importantly, we could fix them before it's too late. Julian stood up, hope replacing the despair of moments earlier. It's risky, he said, but it might just work. We'd have to be very careful, very meticulous. I nodded, adrenaline coursing through me. It won't be easy. We'll have to work day and night, and we'll need help. Trusted people who can assist us without asking too many questions. We could count on Alex, Julian suggested. His legal expertise would be invaluable. The mention of my brother made me hesitate for a moment. Alex had already risked a lot for us. Was it fair to involve him further? But I knew he wouldn't turn us away. You're right, I finally said. I'll call him tonight. We'll also need a team of reliable accountants, maybe even a cybersecurity expert. Julian nodded, clearly already thinking through the details. We could present it as an initiative for transparency and modernization. No one would question our intentions to clean house after your mother's exit. The mention of Mrs. Carter brought new concerns. Julian, I said softly, what will we do about your mother? If we uncover something truly grave, I saw pain cross his face, the inner conflict between filial love and moral duty. Finally, with a deep sigh, he said, we'll do what's right, Mary. Whatever we find, we'll face it head-on. No more secrets, no more cover-ups. A surge of pride and affection for my husband filled me. This was the man I'd married, the one who had been hidden under years of manipulation and family pressure. Good, I said, stepping closer and taking his hand in mine. So, are we in this together? Julian met my eyes, and I saw in them a determination and a spark I hadn't seen in a long time. Together, he affirmed, squeezing my hand. Until the end. That night, while Julian made some preliminary calls, I sat on our balcony with my phone in hand. The city of Valencia stretched out before me, its lights twinkling like earthly stars. I inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of orange blossoms in the air, and dialed Alex's number. Mary, he answered on the third ring. Are you okay? Alex, I said, my voice trembling slightly, I need your help. It's complicated. There was a pause on the other end, then my brother's firm, reassuring voice. Tell me everything, sis. I'm here for you. As I explained the situation, the weight of our plan pressing down on me, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd come. Just weeks ago, I felt powerless and defeated. Now, despite the enormous challenges ahead, I felt strong, determined. Our conversation stretched on for hours. We discussed the risks, the potential consequences, and the strategies we could employ. Alex, ever the pragmatist, warned us about the legal and ethical dangers of what we were considering. It won't be easy, Mary, he finally said. We'll be walking a very fine line between legal and illegal. One misstep, and we could be charged with obstruction. I know, Alex, I replied, feeling the weight of responsibility. But what choice do we have? If we do nothing, eventually everything will come out, and it'll be even worse. There was a long silence on the line, and for a moment I feared Alex might refuse to help us. Finally, with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, he said, all right. I'm in. But we're doing this right, okay? No shortcuts, no half-truths. If we're going to clean up this mess, we do it the right way. Tears welled in my eyes, a mixture of relief and gratitude. Thank you, Alex. I don't know what I'd do without you. Probably get into fewer problems, he joked, and I could almost picture his smile over the phone. Get some rest, Mary. Tomorrow the real work begins. After hanging up, I lingered on the balcony a while longer, letting the cool night breeze soothe my skin and thoughts. Soon, Julian joined me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. How was your call with Alex? He asked softly. He's with us, I replied, leaning into him. It's going to be tough, but I think we can do it. Julian nodded, his gaze lost in the city's horizon. You know, he said after a moment, when I was a kid, my mother used to say the Carters were like the city, strong, resilient, capable of overcoming any adversity. I smiled at the comparison. Well, Valencia has survived invasions, wars, and natural disasters. I suppose we can survive this too. Not just survive, Julian said, turning to me with renewed determination in his eyes. We're going to thrive. We're going to turn this company into something we can really be proud of. As we stood there, embraced under the starlit Valencian sky, I felt a mix of fear and excitement about what lay ahead. The road before us would be fraught with challenges and tough decisions. But for the first time in a long time, I felt truly united with Julian, facing the future together. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, what dark secrets we'd unearth in the company's depths, or how the world would react when we finally brought the truth to light. But one thing was certain, I was no longer the scared, submissive woman who had walked into that office weeks ago. I was stronger now, wiser, and ready to fight for what was right. In the frantic days that followed our confrontation, Julian and I barely slept, pouring every waking moment into our plan for modernization. Alex had temporarily moved to Valencia, setting up in our guest apartment so he could be on call around the clock. Our living room had transformed into a sort of command center, with papers, computers, and whiteboards cluttering every available surface. One especially hot morning, as the July sun beat down on the streets of Valencia, we prepared to take the next crucial step. Today, we would return to the office with a very specific purpose, to launch our internal audit under the guise of modernization. Are we ready? Alex asked as we gathered in the kitchen for a quick breakfast. His face showed signs of exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. Julian nodded, taking a long sip of his coffee. As ready as we can be. Mary has put together a flawless presentation on why we need to update our systems. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling the heavy burden of responsibility. I just hope it's enough to convince everyone without raising suspicions. Alex gave me a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. You'll do great, sis. Remember, you're not lying. They really need to modernize. We're just leaving out a few details. That last phrase sent a pang of guilt through me. Were we doing the right thing? Or were we becoming what we were trying to fix? As if reading my thoughts, Julian stepped closer and took my hand. It's the only way, Mary. If we come straight out with the truth, we might lose everything before we even get a chance to fix it. I nodded, trying to convince myself as much as them. I know. Let's do this. The journey to the office was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. The streets of Valencia were coming alive, with early tourists heading to the beach and locals opening their businesses. The everyday normalcy of the scene was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside us. Arriving at Carter and Associates, I felt my heart race. This time, however, it wasn't fear of Mrs. Carter or the hostile atmosphere, it was the enormity of what we were about to do. We walked confidently through the glass doors. The employees greeted us with a mix of respect and curiosity. Since we'd taken over, the office atmosphere had noticeably shifted. The constant tension of Mrs. Carter's era had given way to cautious optimism. Good morning, everyone, I greeted, trying to sound as natural as possible. Please gather in the conference room in 15 minutes. We have an important announcement. As the staff began to move, following my instructions, we made our way to our office. Alex, posing as an external consultant, followed closely behind. Once inside, Julian closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. All right, here we go. I nodded, a mix of nerves and determination coursing through me. Let's review the plan one last time. For the next few minutes, we went over every detail of our strategy. I would present the modernization initiative, focusing on the need to update our systems and processes. Julian would back up every point I made, emphasizing how these changes would make us more competitive in the market. And Alex, in his role as consultant, would offer an external perspective on industry best practices. At exactly 9 a.m., we entered the conference room. Every employee, from high-ranking executives to the youngest assistants, was present. The anticipation in the room was palpable. I stood before them, feeling the weight of their gazes. Taking a deep breath, I began. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for gathering on such short notice. We're here to discuss the future of Carter and Associates. I saw some people straightening in their seats, others exchanging nervous glances. I continued. Since Julian and I assumed leadership, we've been carefully evaluating every aspect of our operation. And we've reached one undeniable conclusion: we need to modernize. I spent the next half hour detailing our proposal. I spoke about the need to update our computer systems, review and optimize internal processes, and implement new marketing and customer service strategies. With every word, I felt the tension in the room gradually shift to interest and, in some cases, even enthusiasm. Julian then took the floor, reinforcing every point I had made and adding his own vision for how these changes would better position us in the market. Finally, Alex stood up to offer his external perspective. With his legal expertise and natural charisma, he managed to convince even the most skeptical about the necessity of these changes. When we finished the presentation, a tense silence followed. Then, to my surprise, Carmen, one of the longest-serving employees who had always been close to Mrs. Carter, raised her hand. "Mary, Julian," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I want you both to know that I speak for many of us when I say we're behind you." It was about time someone had the courage to shake things up around here. Her words were met with murmurs of agreement. I felt a lump in my throat. These people trusted us. They believed in our vision. The guilt of not revealing the full truth mixed with a renewed determination to do things right. "Thank you, Carmen," I managed. "We deeply appreciate your support. This will be a long and sometimes difficult process, but I'm convinced that together we can take Carter and Associates to new heights." After the meeting, as employees dispersed and some came up to share ideas or express their enthusiasm, I returned to our office with Julian and Alex. We exchanged looks of relief and anxiety. "Well, that first part went well," Alex said. "Now comes the hard part." Julian nodded, his expression serious. "We need to move quickly. The sooner we untangle this mess, the better." "Agreed," I said, feeling the adrenaline of the presentation slowly fade, replaced by a cold determination. "Alex, we need you to start reviewing all contracts and legal agreements. Julian, you handle the financial records. I'll coordinate with the IT team to begin updating our systems." We dove into our work, each absorbed in our own tasks. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Gradually, we began to uncover the full extent of the irregularities. Ghost contracts, duplicate invoices, suspicious transactions. With every discovery, the knot in my stomach tightened further. How had Mrs. Carter managed to hide all this for so long? One afternoon, while poring over some old files, I found something that made my blood run cold. A set of documents suggested that not only was Mrs. Carter involved, but that some prominent figures in Valencia's business community were implicated in an elaborate tax evasion scheme. With trembling hands, I brought the documents to Julian and Alex. "Guys," I whispered, "I think we've uncovered something huge. Really huge." Julian paled at the sight of the papers. "My God, this involves half of Valencia." Alex, ever the pragmatist, began flipping through the documents with a grave expression. "This is serious, very serious. If this comes to light, it could destroy not only our company but the reputation of the entire business community in the city," I added. We fell silent, the weight of our discovery pressing down on us. Finally, Julian spoke. "What do we do now?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. We had three choices: ignore what we'd found and proceed with our original plan, expose everything and face the consequences, or seek a middle ground. We can't ignore this, I finally said. It goes against everything we've been fighting for. Alex nodded. I agree. But we can't just go public with all of this. The ramifications would be catastrophic. Julian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times over the past few weeks. So, what do you suggest? I looked out the window at the sprawling city, Valencia, with its blend of history and modernity, tradition and innovation, a city that had survived invasions, wars, and natural disasters. I think, I said slowly, that we need to have a very serious conversation with someone. Starting with your mother, Julian. He looked at me, surprised. My mother? I thought we agreed to keep her out of all this. It's no longer an option, I replied. We need to know how deep this goes, and she's the only one who has all the answers. Alex interjected, Mary's right. Besides, if we're going to fix this, we'll need her cooperation. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, as if waging an internal battle. When he opened them again, I saw the determination that had once drawn me to him. All right, he said. We'll do it. But together. I nodded, a mix of fear and resolve flooding through me. Together. That night, as we prepared for the confrontation we knew was coming, I couldn't help but reflect on how much things had changed. Just months ago, I had trembled at the thought of facing Mrs. Carter. Now, we were about to confront her with the truth of her actions, backed by irrefutable evidence. The road ahead would be fraught with ethical dilemmas and potential legal repercussions. But as I looked at Julian and Alex, I felt an unshakable certainty. Come what may, we would face this as a family. And together, we'd find a way to do what was right, not just for us, but for everyone affected by Mrs. Carter's actions. With that determination, we prepared for the next day, a turning point in our lives and in the future of Carter and Associates. The morning arrived all too soon. The Valencia sun barely peeked over the horizon as Julian, Alex, and I gathered in the kitchen, preparing for the day ahead. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Are you sure you want to do this? Alex asked, stirring his coffee, his voice laced with concern. Julian and I exchanged a look. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between filial love and moral duty. Finally, he nodded. We have to. For the company, for ourselves, and, even if it sounds contradictory, for my mother too. I took a deep breath, feeling the immense responsibility upon me. Alex is right to ask. Once we take this step, there's no turning back. I know, Julian said, taking my hand. But I believe we passed the point of no return a long time ago. It's time to face the truth, whatever it may be. With that resolve, we headed to the office. The streets of Valencia were already coming alive, filled with early workers and tourists. The city seemed oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold in the heart of its business community. When we arrived at Carter and Associates, the receptionist informed us that Mrs. Carter was already in. Apparently, our request for an urgent meeting had piqued her curiosity, or perhaps her concern. We stopped in front of the conference room door. I could feel my heart pounding, and I noticed Julian's hands trembling slightly. Alex, ever the pillar of calm, gave us an encouraging nod. Let's go, I said, opening the door. Mrs. Carter was seated at the head of the table, her posture impeccable and her piercing gaze as intimidating as ever, though I could see a hint of unease in her eyes. Well, she said with a tense smile. The whole family together. To what do I owe the honor of this urgent meeting? We sat down opposite her, Julian to my right and Alex to my left. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy with tension. Finally, I took the initiative. I pulled out the folder containing the documents we'd uncovered and placed it on the table. Mrs. Carter, I began, my voice firmer than I felt. We've discovered certain irregularities in the company, irregularities that date back several years. I saw her face pale slightly, though she remained impassive. Irregularities? I don't know what you're talking about, dear. I've always run this company with complete transparency and please, Mom, Julian interjected, his voice thick with emotion. Don't make this any harder. We know everything. I opened the folder and began laying out the documents, ghost contracts, duplicate invoices, records of suspicious transactions. With every sheet I placed before her, her facade of control began to crack. This, Alex said, pointing to one particular document, is especially troubling. It suggests a tax evasion scheme involving several prominent companies in Valencia. A deafening silence followed. Mrs. Carter stared at the documents, her expression a mix of shock and, for the first time, fear. How did you find these?" she finally whispered. "That doesn't matter now," I replied. "What matters is what we're going to do about it." Mrs. Carter looked up, her eyes moving between the three of us. For a moment, I saw the woman behind the tough exterior, the woman who had built an empire from nothing, the woman who, somewhere along the way, had lost her way. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice heavy with resignation. Julian leaned forward. "We want the truth, Mom. The whole truth. And we want your help to fix this." For hours, Mrs. Carter told us everything, how she'd started with small irregularities to keep the company afloat during tough times, how those irregularities had grown into something far more dangerous, how the fear of losing it all had driven her to make increasingly questionable decisions. As she spoke, I saw years of tension and secrets lifting from her shoulders. It was as if, finally, she could breathe freely after decades of bearing that burden. When she finished, we sat in silence, processing everything. Finally, Alex spoke. "Now that we know the extent of the problem, we need to decide how to proceed." I looked to Julian for his opinion. He nodded, as if giving me permission to speak what we had discussed the night before. "We believe," I said slowly, "that the best way forward is complete transparency. We're going to conduct a full audit of the company, correct all the irregularities, and, if necessary, face the legal consequences." Mrs. Carter looked at us with a mix of surprise and, was that admiration? "Are you willing to risk everything for this? You could lose it all. Or we could save it all," Julian replied. "Mom, this is our chance to do things right, to cleanse the name of Carter and Associates and start over." I saw tears welling in Mrs. Carter's eyes. It was the first time I'd seen her vulnerable. I don't know what to say. After everything I've done, after the way I treated you both, are you really willing to help me?" I took a deep breath before answering. "We're not doing this just for you, Mrs. Carter. We're doing it for the company, for the employees who depend on us, and for ourselves. But yes, we're willing to work together to fix this." The following months were a whirlwind of activity. We worked tirelessly, often late into the night, to unravel the complex web of irregularities. Alex coordinated with a team of lawyers and forensic accountants to ensure every step we took was legal and ethical. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, doubt, and even despair. But with every obstacle we overcame, I felt us growing stronger as a team. The most surprising change was in Mrs. Carter herself. The stern, unyielding woman I had known gradually transformed. She began to listen more, value others' opinions, even admit when she was wrong. It was as if, by shedding the weight of her secrets, she rediscovered a part of herself long lost. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the day came to present our findings and action plan to the board and the relevant authorities. The boardroom was packed. Representatives from the tax agency, board members, and our legal team all were there, waiting to hear what we had to say. Standing before them, I felt an unexpected calm. I glanced at Julian, who gave me an encouraging nod, and at Alex, whose presence always bolstered my strength. Even Mrs. Carter, seated in a corner, offered me a small, supportive smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "we're here today to present the results of our internal audit and our plan to correct the irregularities we've discovered." For the next 2 hours, we detailed everything we'd found and the measures we proposed to rectify the situation. We spoke of restitution, structural reforms, and new systems of oversight and transparency. When we finished, there was a tense silence. Then, to my surprise, the representative from the tax agency was the first to speak. "I must say," he began, "in all my years of service, I've never seen a company address its issues with such honesty and proactivity. While the irregularities are serious, your approach to correcting them is commendable." One by one, board members and legal representatives echoed similar sentiments. Despite acknowledging the gravity of the situation, they appreciated our transparency and our action plan. At the end of the meeting, we reached a preliminary agreement. There would be consequences, substantial fines, a period of intense supervision, and a long road to rebuilding trust. But most importantly, we had a chance to do things right, to rebuild Carter and Associates on a solid, ethical foundation. That night, as Julian, Alex, Mrs. Carter, and I shared dinner on the terrace at home, I reflected on the journey we'd undertaken. It had started with fear and uncertainty, but it had led us to a place of strength and unity I never thought possible. Mrs. Carter raised her glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "To family. Not just the ties of blood, but the family we choose and fight for." "Mary," she said, looking directly at me, "I was wrong about you from the start. You're stronger and wiser than I ever gave you credit for. Thank you for not giving up on this family, even when I gave you every reason to." Tears welled in my eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. I think we've all learned and grown through this." Julian took my hand under the table. "To a new beginning," he said, raising his glass. "To a new beginning," we all echoed. As we toasted under the starlit Valencia sky, I felt a profound sense of peace and hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together we were united and stronger than ever. And I was sure that, together, we could face any challenge the future might bring. The victory we achieved wasn't what we'd expected when we embarked on this journey. It was something deeper, more meaningful. We'd won the battle against our own fears, against the temptation to take the easy way out. We had chosen truth, integrity, and family above all else. And that, I realized, was the sweetest victory of all.